Hello, I'm Dr. Sharon Pittaway from Swinburne Online. This is a podcast on marking with a holistic rubric or standard statement. The traditional rubric has its place and is possibly what you're most used to when marking student work at SOL, but there is another form of marking guide that's being used by academics and those who design assessment tasks, and it's what's known as a standard statement or a holistic rubric. Marking student work is a subjective experience, no matter what form of rubric we use, and there are legitimate criticisms of rubrics in general. Alfie Kohn, for one, says judgments ultimately turn on adjectives that are murky and end up being left to the teacher's discretion. Now that's problematic when there are 15 teachers who are making judgments about students' work. And in assessing student work, he says it's possible to get a bunch of people to agree on what rating to give an assignment as long as they're willing to accept and apply someone else's narrow criteria for what merits that rating. Once we check our judgment at the door, we can all learn to give a 4 to exactly the same things. So assessment of student work is not without its problems and challenges, but it's a practice that's now firmly embedded in educational contexts from the kindergarten to university, and we can't escape it. The question that we must grapple with then is how we ensure that we assess as effectively and transparently as possible. The traditional rubric breaks the task down into criteria, and we tend to use words like poor, good, very good and excellent to describe the various components of the task. For example, good use of scholarly sources or excellent integration of source material. But what does that actually look like in a student paper? There are real challenges with this kind of marking guide. If we cannot describe what good integration of source material looks like, then we have a problem. We're not being transparent, and we're doing nothing to help develop students' assessment literacy. One other problem is that some rubrics contain a quantitative approach, and so we might have something like uses 5 scholarly sources for a pass award and uses 15 scholarly sources for a distinction. Marking should never be about quantity, it should always be about quality. It shouldn't ever come down to how many, but to how well. We need to assess the quality of a student's submission, not the number of things they did or didn't do, as in the number of references they used or the number of errors they made in their writing. An alternative to the traditional rubric is the standard statement or holistic rubric. In this form of assessment document, we see statements about what is required to achieve a particular standard. And yes, the criticism of relying on murky adjectives can still apply, but the main difference is that we look at the student's submission as a whole piece of work. We come to the marking task with an understanding of what a pass or a credit looks like as a whole. We're thinking holistically, not in the atomised way we look at a piece of work when marking with a traditional rubric. Let's look at an example. This example is from a final year undergraduate education unit and is the first assessment task. Students must write a 1,500-word persuasive argument in the form of an essay, and they must argue a particular stance. They get to choose the stance they take. They have the choice of 4 essay questions to answer, one of which is, what is the purpose of assessment in primary school? The criteria are quite generic. 1 is content and development of argument, 2 is essay structure, 3 is use and integration of source material, and 4 is academic writing style. These criteria are adapted from the University of Sydney's work on measuring academic skills of university students, or MASS's criteria, initially developed to use as a diagnostic tool to determine the academic skills of university students. I tend to use them outside of the diagnostic context because I think they're useful for this kind of task, the essay, where we want students to think critically, to answer the question so that we know they know what the question is asking, and they're able to establish and sustain a particular line of thinking that's relevant to the question. Many students want to write about everything they know rather than directly and clearly answering the question, as well as to demonstrate their capacity for logically structuring their argument, for drawing on and integrating information, so that we know they're not merely giving an opinion, but are demonstrating their familiarity with the body of literature available to them, and therefore providing evidence of their informed opinion. The criteria are generic enough to allow students to demonstrate achievement of the learning outcomes, one of the vital principles of constructive alignment. But let's get down to the example. Students are writing a 1,500-word essay. They've chosen their question, done some reading, planned their arguments. Then they decide to look at the standard statement and they see a number of things. The first is a general statement about the pass standard, which says, in order to pass this assessment task, all aspects of the task must be completed. And that means in this regard, with an essay, there has to be an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. That's part of the essay. That's part of the aspects of the task. The work must be the author's own, except where correctly cited works of others have been used. They can't get a pass if they've used somebody else's work, because you're not marking somebody else, you're marking this student's work. And if they've used great swathes of somebody else, then we need to assign that person a grade, not the student. And the requirements of all criteria met at a satisfactory level, so all 4 criteria. What comes next is, specifically this means that the essay includes a clearly stated thesis statement. That's just part of essay writing. An introduction that introduces both the topic of the essay and the essay itself. So when a student goes to prepare their assignment, they can look at this almost as a checklist and say, have I introduced the topic and have I introduced the essay? Because that's what an introduction does. Introduces the topic, introduces the essay. If they haven't done that, then they haven't completed all aspects of the task, because they haven't done what an essay is supposed to do. Paragraphs that explore one key idea each. So we know that in an essay, a paragraph explores one key idea, is not jammed full of a whole lot of different ideas. 1 point per paragraph, one idea per paragraph. And so again, they can say when they're looking at their work before submission, using this almost as a checklist, does each paragraph explore one key idea, or are there multiple ideas contained within this paragraph? If there are multiple ideas, maybe I need to pull it apart, start to restructure my essay. A clear argument that is developed logically across the essay. Does it start here at this point and then build on from that point to the next one until we reach the conclusion? Use of relevant, scholarly and non-scholarly literature. So there's a range of literature they can use to draw from, but they must draw from some. If they haven't drawn on literature, then they haven't completed all aspects of the task, so they cannot be awarded a pass. Correct citation where work is not the author's original work. A rule of thumb to use is that if more than 10% of the work is somebody else's, in direct quotations, then the student has used too many direct quotations. So you can talk with your students about that particular aspect. Academic writing that is generally free from spelling and grammatical errors. Now, I think that's pretty clear, but then I would, because I wrote it, and so I know what was in my head at the time. It lays out the basic features of an essay. And you're right, at first glance there may not be much about quality in there, apart from references to clear. But what does clear mean? We know that clear, when we're thinking about the hallmarks of critical thinking, means clarity. And so a clearly stated thesis statement is one that is characterised by the clarity of critical thinking. It relates to the topic. It is a thesis statement, which, as you know, is the sentence or two that contains the focus of the essay and tells the reader what the essay is going to be about. Or to put it another way, it's the answer to the question in a sentence or two. And the writing is clear enough that the reader doesn't have to guess at what is meant. It's the author's task to ensure their meaning is clearly stated. The reader should never have to guess or say, I think this is what the author means. If you find yourself doing this, then the author hasn't done their job. So part of clearly stated means a lack of ambiguity in the writing. Again, just one of the hallmarks of critical thinking. It means precision in the terminology used. If a student uses a specific educational term, then they need to have used it correctly. So accuracy is also part of what is meant by clear. You know that because you're in the position that you're in, but you might need to do this unpacking for students through the Collaborate session that you might run, through discussions on the discussion board. So you can see that quality is inherent within these descriptors. And this sort of unpacking is necessary in moderation meetings just to make sure that everybody is on the same page. And just as it's necessary part of the moderation discussions when deciding what good means in a traditional rubric. So students have done the basics to be awarded a pass, and then what we want to see is an increase in the depth of knowledge and understanding, in the rigour of the argument, in the use of literature to support the arguments presented, and in the quality of the writing, of a student's capacity to communicate in writing for a particular audience, for the student to be awarded anything above a pass. The credit standard in this example again begins with a general statement. To be awarded a credit, students must fulfil all the requirements of the pass level, but with more sophistication. And the all is really important. Not most, not some, not limited number of, but all the requirements of the pass level to be awarded a credit, but with more sophistication. So you need to be really clear about what the pass means before you can start to look at what the credit means, and then really clear about what the credit level means before you can have a look at what the distinction and high distinction standards are. To unpack what sophistication means, there's a more specific set of expectations laid out. And so it says the main difference between a pass and a credit is in the relevance of the argument to the essay question. So at the pass level, it might be that the argument tangentially related to the essay question, but here we want to see that it's more relevant to the essay question. Again, in your moderation, you can have a look at a number of student papers and say, this one is more relevant, this argument is more relevant. I can see that because of these particular features. The clarity and precision of the argument, the development of the argument, the ways ideas, insights, evidence and commentary are used to expand specific claims. Again, we're talking here about the main differences between a pass and a credit. The clarity of the essay structure. So we're looking at the quality of the work. The relevance, rigour and correctness of the evidence cited. It needs to be more relevant, rigorous and correct than at the pass level. The way evidence is integrated into the argument, the significance of the issues for teachers' assessment practice. So we've brought something new in here. This is another level of standard that the credit student must adhere to be awarded a credit, and the correctness and clarity of the writing. What this requires of us as markers is a very good understanding of the persuasive essay so that we can recognise these elements in students' writing. We know a clear and precise argument when we see one and aren't merely taken in by fancy words or well put together sentences. We don't want to get into a situation where we award students a credit or above because the writing is good. There needs to be substance as well as style. And I'm sure you all are familiar with examples from primary and high school where a student who has neat handwriting does better than a student who has scratchy handwriting, despite the quality of the ideas and the arguments put forward. We don't want that to happen here. Just because the student might know how to write doesn't mean that they've written with any substance. So we need to be looking for substance as well as style. And again, that will be part of the moderation conversation. What kind of substance are you looking for and how will you recognise it? Well, using this standard statement, you know that the argument has to relate to the question. The student cannot have gone off on a tangent and just be writing general things about assessment if they want to be awarded a credit or above. They need to develop an argument, and that's a skill in itself. One of the things you can be doing as an ELA on a weekly basis is showing examples of good arguments, of clearly argued pieces of writing, and pointing out the features of a decent argument, one that's argued clearly and logically. And you can ask students to do the same. You don't have to do all the work. Ask students to submit examples of quality pieces of work where the writing is good, but where the argument is clear and logical. Another feature of the substance you're looking for in the student's work is the way ideas, insights, evidence and commentary are used to expand specific claims. This is about the substance, and it requires some sophistication on the student's part. They need to know what a claim is. A student might write something like, "Assessment is the most important part of teaching." This claim is written as a statement of fact or truth, but it's obviously not a statement of fact or truth. It's not a fact. It's not a truth. Someone else might argue that relationships are the most important part of teaching. It's one idea about teaching, It's not one that everybody will agree with. They therefore need evidence to support this claim. Who says that assessment is the most important part of teaching? And this is where the informed opinion comes into play. It might be their opinion that assessment is the most important part of teaching, but at university level, we don't deal with opinions. We want informed opinions. Who has informed their thinking in this regard? That's the evidence required in this aspect of the standard statement. And of course, because they're developing an argument, they cannot simply make that claim and move on. There need to be ideas, commentary, insights written around that particular claim. It's part of the argument. It's not the whole part. I encourage you then, when using this kind of marking guide, to ensure that your moderation conversations are rigorous and detailed, that they move beyond what did you give this paper, but that they start with unpacking the marking guide and discussing your understanding of each point. Doing this with a range of student papers is a good way to go. Or another way you can do this, if you're going to have a moderation conversation before student papers come in, is to write your own essays in response to the task and use these for the purposes of moderation. A much more difficult task, but it might be really worthwhile nonetheless. Now, I won't go into the distinction and high distinction standards because I'm sure you have the idea by now. And now on to the pragmatics. One of the questions ELAs ask about this form of marking guide is how you use it with Blackboard when you're asked to assign individual grades to students' work in Turnitin. Well, the most important thing I can say about that at the outset is that we shouldn't let the technology determine our practice. Just because it's a feature of Turnitin doesn't mean we have to use it or let it shape what we do. Secondly, if you do want to assign specific grades to specific criteria, and you should have a clearly articulated reason for doing that, then I would suggest that if you're awarding a credit overall, that you give credits for each criterion. The feedback is the most useful part of your marking practice, and it's important not to socialise students into thinking that they don't know where they're at unless they have an award for each criterion. Let's move their thinking from criteria to the work as a whole. You can still give feedback on individual criteria using the standard statement. That's quite different from assigning a grade to individual criteria. Well, hopefully that gives you some information and some insight on this form of marking guide and helps you determine how you might use it in assessing student work. If you have any questions or concerns or any feedback, I'm more than happy to discuss this with you further. You can email me at spitaway@swinburneonline.com. All the best and happy marking.